12,000 years ago, someone carved a bag into solid stone. Not a random shape, a container with a rigid body and a curved handle gripped in the hand of a figure that, by every conventional account of ancient history, shouldn't have existed. Yet, here's the detail that makes it genuinely unsettling. That exact same shape, the same body, the same handle, the same grip turns up again and again across 3 separate continents, carved by people who never met, never traded, and had no way of copying each other's imagery. And in every single depiction across 12,000 years, nobody ever shows what's inside. Not one stick with this, because by the end you'll likely look at ancient art a little differently. Start with the place that upended the field. Southeastern Turkey. A quiet hilltop local farmers had walked over for generations, with no idea what sat beneath their feet. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating there at a site called Göbekli Tepe. And what he found didn't just add a new entry to the history books. It forced historians to rewrite the opening chapter of civilization itself. Göbekli Tepe is more than 11,000 years old, and some of its oldest structures push toward 12,000, roughly 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt, predating writing pottery, the wheel and permanent farming villages. The accepted model of human history held that people needed agriculture and settled towns before they could organize the manpower for massive stone construction. Göbekli Tepe broke that model outright because the people who built it were by every indication hunter-gatherers, and yet they carved and raised multi-shaped limestone pillars arranged into circular enclosures, decorated with detailed carvings of foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and strange human-like figures. Schmidt himself suggested something that flipped the standard narrative on its head, that large-scale communal ritual may have come before civilization, rather than after that shared belief pulled people together to build something enormous long before farming gave them any reason to settle down. Part 2. Here is the detail most documentaries skip, and it matters most for this story. Around 1,000 years ago, the people who built Göbekli Tepe did something deliberate. They buried it. They filled the enclosures with rubble and soil, sealing the entire complex as though protecting it, hiding it, or shutting it away from something. Consider the scale involved. Some pillars stand over 5 meters tall and weigh more than 10 tons apiece. Moving and shaping stones that size, then arranging them into precise circular patterns would have required dozens or hundreds of people working together over extended periods, all fed and organized without agricultural support. That alone tells us these weren't scattered, disorganized wanderers. There was leadership planning and shared purpose, strong enough to mobilize large groups. And the fact that they later chose to bury the whole complex rather than let it collapse through simple neglect tells us they still cared about what happened to it, even after they stopped using it. Among the carvings on those buried pillars is a shape that recurs throughout this entire story, a container with a defined rigid body and a curved handle held in a figure's hand. Some researchers now refer to it as the handbag of the gods. Göbekli Tepe is the earliest known place where it appears jump forward roughly 7,000 years to a completely different civilization in a completely different place. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates in what's now Iraq. This is where the Sumerians built the first cities, developed the first writing system, and left behind thousands of clay tablets recording their laws, trade stories, and gods. Part 3. Buried inside Sumerian mythology is a group of beings most people outside ancient history circles have never heard of the Apkallu. According to Sumerian and later Babylonian texts, the Apkallu weren't ordinary humans. They were described as wise sages sent to teach humanity the basics of civilization after a great flood destroyed the world that came before writing mathematics, farming, architecture, law. In Mesopotamian art, the Apkallu appear in several forms, some as winged human figures in ceremonial robes, some with eagle heads on human bodies, and some as fishmen, part fish and part human simultaneously. That last version connects to one of the strangest figures in ancient mythology. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek around 278 BCE but drawing on much older Sumerian sources, described a being called Oannes. In surprisingly specific detail, a fish's body with a human head underneath the fish's head and human feet emerging from beneath the fishtail. By day, Oannes came out of the sea onto dry land and taught people writing geometry, farming, city planning, and law. By night, he returned to the water. It's an oddly precise description for a myth. It almost reads like someone reaching for the closest available comparisons to describe something real. Berossus wasn't the only source either fragments of his account were quoted by later ancient writers, and imagery matching this fishman description appears on Assyrian palace reliefs and in small carved figurines recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, spanning many centuries. Whatever idea originally sat behind Oannes, it clearly persisted in the culture for an extremely long time, passed down deliberately, rather than fading out the way. A random, invented story usually would. Here is the detail that ties Oannes and the Apkallu directly back to Göbekli Tepe. In nearly every depiction of these teacher figures across Mesopotamian art, spanning thousands of years across throne rooms, temple carvings, and cylinder seals, they're shown holding the exact same object, a structured container with a curved handle. In their other hand, they often hold a cone-shaped object which mainstream archaeology interprets as a tool for applying ritual liquids such as water or oil. The standard explanation is called the bandudu, a ceremonial bucket used in purification rituals. To be fair, this isn't an invented explanation. Water and oil purification rituals genuinely were a major part of Mesopotamian religious life, and some cylinder seals do depict scenes resembling purification ceremonies. If Mesopotamia were the only place this symbol appeared, the bucket theory would be a reasonable, unremarkable, and probably correct answer, part 4. But several problems complicate that simple explanation. First, the beings holding this object aren't ordinary priests performing a water ritual. They're the Apkallu, the exact beings credited with founding civilization itself in Sumerian belief, with the figures remembered for giving humanity writing, mathematics, and law really be remembered generation after generation, specifically for carrying a water bucket. Second, the shape doesn't really match a bucket. Ancient depictions of actual buckets typically show a wide open top, since you need to see and access the liquid inside. What the Apkallu carry has a closed, rigid structured shape built for carrying something securely, not for pouring liquid out. Third, and this is the detail that really breaks the simple explanation, the same object shows up in places Mesopotamian religion couldn't possibly have reached. That brings us back to Göbekli Tepe, 7,000 years before Sumerian civilization even existed, where the same handled container is already carved into stone. If the object started as a Sumerian ritual bucket, how did it end up on a hilltop in Turkey, thousands of years before Sumer was founded? And it doesn't stop there. This is where the story crosses an ocean entirely. In the Mexican state of Veracruz, at the ancient Olmec site of La Venta, there's a carved stone monument known as Stela, 19, dating back roughly 3,000 years. It depicts a standing figure in elaborate ceremonial dress interacting with a feathered serpent, one of the most important symbols in Mesoamerican religion, the same figure that would later become Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya. And in his hand, that figure holds an object that looks remarkably like the same handled container. Part 5. Olmec civilization is widely considered the founding culture of Mesoamerica. Its writing systems, calendar, and architecture developed independently with no credible evidence of direct contact with the ancient Middle East. These were two civilizations separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years with no realistic way of copying each other's symbols. The standard scientific response to all this is coincidence. Different cultures around the world sometimes independently land on similar symbols purely by chance. That's a fair point, and it does happen. But coincidence usually produces variation. If separate cultures independently invented a handled container symbol by accident, you'd expect it to carry different meanings in different places. A trade symbol here, a farming tool there, a random decorative motif somewhere else. Instead, in every culture where this object appears, the context is nearly identical. It's always held by a divine or semi-divine figure, always connected to the origin of knowledge, always tied to the moment civilization was supposedly handed to humanity. The pattern gets stranger still once you look beyond Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. In Maori tradition from New Zealand, there's a myth about the god Taini climbing to the highest heaven and bringing back 3 baskets containing different categories of sacred knowledge. Once again, a divine figure, a container knowledge delivered to humanity, appearing on the opposite side of the planet with no realistic route of cultural contact.